Hi there. Please let your mind slow down and go at ease, and let me know in the comments where you're from. Also, what's your best tip for a peaceful night's sleep and keeping a calm mind? Whether it's a relaxing bedtime ritual, a favorite book, or a mindfulness practice, your advice could be just what someone needs. The figure in the fog. There's a winding old road on the edge of town that cuts through a dense, foggy forest. Locals call it the Phantom's Road, and it's known for strange occurrences, disappearing cars, eerie sounds, and ghostly figures that appear in the mist. I'd always heard the stories, but I never believed them. Until one night, I drove down that road myself. It was late, and the fog was so thick I could barely see a few feet ahead. The trees on either side of the road loomed like dark shadows, their twisted branches reaching out like hands, creating an eerie tunnel of fog and shadows. I drove slowly, my headlights barely cutting through the mist, the air heavy and still, filled with an unnatural quiet that made my skin prickle. As I rounded a curve, I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, barely visible in the dim light. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as the car screeched to a stop. The figure was still, shrouded in fog, their outline blurred, like a shadow caught in the mist. I honked, hoping they'd move, but they remained perfectly still, their gaze fixed on me, their posture rigid, almost unnatural. The figure wore old-fashioned clothing, a long, dark coat that seemed out of place, and their face was hidden, obscured by shadows. A chill crawled down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, to flee. But something held me in place, a strange, gnawing compulsion to stay, to understand. I rolled down the window, calling out, but my voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the fog, as though the mist itself were alive, listening. Then, slowly, the figure began to move, stepping closer, each movement slow, deliberate, their gaze never leaving mine. I felt a deep, bone-chilling dread, a sense that I was seeing something that should never be seen, something bound to the road, trapped in the fog. Just as the figure reached the edge of the headlights, I saw their face, pale, hollow, their eyes empty, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed endless. They raised a hand, pointing down the road, and in a voice barely more than a whisper, they spoke. "Don't go down this road." The words echoed in my mind, filled with a haunting, hollow tone that made my chest ache. I nodded, backing up the car, my hands shaking as I shifted into reverse. The figure watched, their gaze unblinking, their expression filled with a sadness that seemed timeless, bound to the road, to the fog. I turned the car around, driving away, my heart racing, the figure disappearing into the mist behind me. Since that night, I've avoided the Phantom's Road, too afraid of what I might see. But sometimes, in the early morning fog, I feel their presence, see their faint outline in the mist, a reminder of the spirit I encountered, the one who lingers in the fog, forever bound to the road they could never leave, the boy in the library. When I started working at the town library, I was thrilled to be surrounded by endless rows of books, the soft hum of silence, and the comforting smell of paper and dust. But the library was old, with high ceilings and dark corners, and at night it took on a different feel, something heavy, almost watchful, I had been warned about the late shifts, that strange things happened after closing, but I brushed it off as local superstition. Then, one evening, as I was shelving books in the history section, I felt a chill pass over me. The library was empty, silent except for the creak of the old building settling, but I had the unmistakable feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned, scanning the rows of shelves, but there was nothing there, only shadows stretching into the dim light. As I returned to shelving, I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet along the carpet. I froze, listening, my heart pounding as the sound grew closer, echoing through the empty aisles. I called out, expecting to see a late visitor, but the library remained silent, empty. But just as I was about to turn away, I saw him, a young boy standing at the end of the aisle, his head tilted, his gaze fixed on something beyond me. He was no older than 8, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face pale, his eyes dark and hollow, filled with a sadness that made my chest ache. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice trembling, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked down the aisle, his footsteps silent, his figure barely visible in the dim light. I followed, my pulse racing, but as I reached the end of the aisle, he was gone, leaving only the lingering smell of damp earth and dust. Over the next few nights, the boy continued to appear, always at a distance, always watching, his expression filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed endless. I tried to ignore him, to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But each time he appeared, he grew clearer, his figure more defined, as though he were becoming a part of the library itself. One evening, just before closing, I found him in the far corner of the library, standing by an old, dust-covered bookshelf that hadn't been used in years. As I approached, he turned to me, his gaze intense, and in a voice barely more than a whisper, he spoke. "Please, find me." The words sent a chill down my spine, filling the air with a sorrow so profound it seemed to seep into the walls, into the very fabric of the building. I reached out, hoping to touch him, to comfort him, but he vanished, leaving only silence and the faint scent of old books. The next day, I asked my supervisor about it, hoping she'd have an explanation. Her expression grew dark, and she sighed, her gaze distant, as though remembering something long forgotten. "They say a boy went missing here, years ago. His mother searched for him for days, but he was never found. Some believe he's still here, waiting, hoping to be found. Since that night, the boy hasn't appeared again, but sometimes, light at night, I feel his presence, sense his gaze, a reminder of the spirit that lingers in the shadows, forever bound to the library, waiting for someone to bring him peace. The lantern in the woods. There's a dense old forest on the outskirts of my town, a place people avoid after dark. It's filled with narrow, winding trails that seem to lead nowhere, disappearing into thick tangles of trees and undergrowth. But the forest has a reputation, a place where people vanish, where strange lights appear at night, flickering like ghostly lanterns among the trees. One autumn evening, my curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to explore the forest just before dusk. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, and the forest was silent, thick with a heavy, oppressive quiet that made my skin prickle. I wandered through the trails, the trees looming overhead like dark, twisted sentinels, their branches casting long, eerie shadows over the ground. As the sun began to set, I saw it, a faint, glowing light in the distance, flickering through the trees like a candle in the wind. At first, I thought it was another hiker, maybe someone camping, but the light was too steady, too bright, casting an unnatural glow over the forest floor. I followed it, feeling a strange, gnawing compulsion to get closer, to see who or what was holding the lantern. The light moved deeper into the forest, weaving through the trees, leading me down narrow, overgrown paths that I didn't recognize. I called out, hoping for a reply, but the only answer was silence, thick and unyielding. Finally, the light stopped, hovering just ahead, illuminating a small, open clearing surrounded by twisted, ancient trees. I stepped into the clearing, my breath catching as I saw her, a woman, barely visible in the dim light, holding a lantern that glowed with an eerie, pale light. She was dressed in old, tattered clothing, her face pale, her eyes hollow, filled with a sorrow that made my chest ache. She raised the lantern, her gaze locking onto mine, and in a voice barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "Come closer." Her words were filled with a haunting, hollow tone, a sadness so profound it seemed to seep into my bones, filling the air with a heavy, oppressive energy. I took a step forward, unable to resist, but a deep, instinctual fear held me back, warning me of something I couldn't understand. The woman moved closer, her figure flickering like a shadow caught in the wind, her expression filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like it would drown me. She held out the lantern, her gaze intense, and in a voice barely audible, she spoke again. "Help me." The words echoed through the clearing, filling the air with a strange, suffocating silence that made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn back, to flee, but her gaze held me in place, a silent, pleading look that filled me with an unexplainable sorrow. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The lantern's light extinguished, leaving only darkness and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Since that night, I haven't returned to the forest, but sometimes in the early morning fog, I see her, a faint figure standing at the edge of the trees, holding a lantern that glows with an eerie, otherworldly light, a reminder of the spirit that lingers in the woods, forever waiting for someone to find her, to bring her peace. The music from the attic. When I was young, my family lived in an old Victorian house that had once belonged to a musician. The house was filled with hidden nooks and small, forgotten rooms, and my favorite place to explore was the attic. It was crammed with dusty trunks, forgotten furniture, and most intriguingly, an old, out-of-tune piano that sat alone in the far corner, its keys yellowed with age. My parents said it was broken, long silent, and no one knew how to repair it. One night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint, soft melody drifting down from the attic. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the music grew louder, filling the air with a haunting, sorrowful tune that made my chest ache. I crept out of bed, my heart pounding, and followed the sound, each note pulling me closer, drawing me up the narrow staircase to the attic. The attic was dark, filled with shadows that seemed to shift and flicker in the dim light. But the music continued, its melody echoing through the silence, each note filled with a sadness that felt endless, timeless. As I approached the piano, the music grew softer, as though whoever was playing could sense my presence. I called out, hoping for an answer, but the only response was the gentle, hollow echo of the music. I stood there, transfixed, feeling a strange, unexplainable sorrow, a weight pressing down on me, filling the air with an energy that felt both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The next morning, I asked my parents if they'd heard the music, but they just shook their heads, brushing it off as my imagination. But the melody lingered in my mind, haunting me, filling my thoughts with its soft, sorrowful tones. The music continued, always at night, always faint, drifting down from the attic like a ghostly lullaby. Each time the tune was slightly different, filled with subtle, haunting changes, as though the musician were trying to tell me something, to convey a message hidden within each note. One evening, unable to resist, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the attic. I climbed the stairs, my hands trembling, my heart pounding as the music grew louder, filling the attic with its haunting melody. I reached the piano, my breath catching as I saw a figure, a man, barely visible, his fingers moving gracefully over the keys, his expression solemn, his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed endless. I watched, unable to move, my heart pounding as the man continued to play, each note filled with a haunting beauty that made my chest ache. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, he spoke. "Please, remember me." His words echoed in the silence, each one filled with a longing that seemed to seep into the walls, into the very fabric of the house. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, leaving only silence, the piano keys still, the air thick with a sorrowful, hollow energy. Since that night, I haven't heard the music again. But sometimes, late at night, I feel his presence, sense his gaze, a reminder of the musician who lingers, forever bound to the piano, playing his sorrowful tune for an audience he'll never have. The woman in the cemetery. There's an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a quiet, overgrown place filled with crumbling gravestones and twisted trees. I'd always been drawn to it, fascinated by the stories of the people who lay buried there, each stone a marker of a life once lived. But there was one grave that stood out, an unmarked stone near the far corner of the cemetery, hidden beneath a large, twisted tree. One evening, just before sunset, I decided to visit the cemetery. The air was cool, filled with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, and as I walked among the graves, I felt a strange, heavy energy, a sense that I wasn't alone. The cemetery was silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind, but as I approached the unmarked grave, I saw her. She was standing beneath the tree, her figure barely visible in the fading light. She was dressed in a long, flowing gown, her hair cascading over her shoulders, her face pale, her eyes hollow and filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. She didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, her gaze fixed on the ground, her expression one of endless longing. I wanted to speak, to ask who she was, but fear held me in place, rooting me to the spot. I watched as she slowly knelt beside the grave, her hand reaching out to touch the cold, unmarked stone, her gaze filled with a sadness that felt ancient, timeless. In a voice barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "Why did you leave me?" Her words drifted through the air, filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to seep into the ground, into the trees, filling the cemetery with an energy that made my skin crawl. I felt a strange, overwhelming sympathy, a need to understand, to listen. But the woman remained silent, her gaze unchanging, her presence filling the air with a heavy, hollow silence. The next day, I asked the caretaker about the grave, hoping he'd have an answer. He looked at me, his expression dark, his voice barely a whisper. "They say she was a young woman, heartbroken, abandoned by her lover. She came here every day, waiting, hoping he would return. When she died, she was buried here, unmarked, and they say her spirit still waits, longing for the one she lost. Since that night, I haven't returned to the cemetery, but sometimes, in the early morning mist, I see her, a faint figure standing by the unmarked grave, her gaze fixed on something beyond this world, a reminder of the spirit who lingers, forever bound to the place where her heart was broken. The haunted photograph. When I was in college, I loved going to flea markets and thrift stores, looking for unique finds to decorate my apartment. One day, I came across an old sepia-toned photograph in an ornate gilded frame. It was a portrait of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all dressed in turn-of-the-century clothing. Something about the photograph felt eerie, almost magnetic. The expressions on their faces were solemn, their eyes deep and intense, and the little girl's face had an almost pleading look, as if she were trying to say something. I brought the photograph home, placing it on the shelf in my living room. But almost immediately, strange things began happening. At first, it was small, objects moving slightly out of place, lights flickering on and off. Then, one night, I noticed that the photograph had shifted, angled just slightly, as though someone had been looking at it and put it back hastily. I brushed it off, thinking it must have fallen a little due to the frame's weight. But then, one night, as I was passing by the photograph, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The little girl's expression had changed. Her mouth, which had been a thin, unsmiling line, was now parted slightly, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I leaned in closer, unable to believe my eyes, and that's when I heard it, a faint, soft whisper drifting through the silence, barely more than a breath. "Help me!" The words echoed in my mind, filling the room with a heavy, oppressive energy that seemed to seep into the walls. I backed away, heart pounding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the little girl was watching me, her gaze filled with a silent, desperate plea. Over the next few nights, the photograph continued to change, the expressions of the family members growing more sorrowful, more intense, as though they were slowly coming to life. The man's face took on a look of stern determination. The woman's eyes filled with worry, and the little girl's expression grew more pleading, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. One evening, unable to take it any longer, I decided to cover the photograph, hoping it would put an end to the haunting. I draped a cloth over it, securing it tightly, and went to bed, feeling a strange sense of relief. But that night, I woke to a soft, muffled sobbing, drifting through the silence, filling the air with a sorrow so deep it left me breathless. I sat up, heart pounding, and turned on the light. The cloth was gone, folded neatly at the foot of the shelf, and the photograph was there, uncovered. The little girl's gaze fixed on me, her expression filled with a desperate, pleading sadness. Desperate for answers, I took the photograph back to the flea market, hoping to find out more about its origins. The vendor looked at me, his face darkening as he recognized the frame. That photo, it's of a family who lived in a nearby house, one that burned down years ago. They say the little girl was trapped inside, and her spirit lingers, waiting, hoping to find peace. I left the photograph with him, too frightened to keep it. But even now, I can still feel her presence, sense her gaze, a reminder of the spirit I left behind, forever bound to the photograph, waiting, pleading for release. The figure in the field. My grandparents' house was surrounded by acres of open fields, stretching as far as the eye could see, bordered by a dense line of trees. I loved visiting them, spending my summers exploring the fields and watching the sunsets from their back porch. But there was one spot in the field that everyone avoided, a small patch where the grass refused to grow, the earth dry and cracked even in the rain. My grandparents called it the dead patch, and they'd always warn me to stay away from it. One summer evening, just before dusk, curiosity got the better of me, and I ventured out to see the dead patch for myself. The air grew colder as I approached, a strange, unnatural chill that made my skin prickle. The patch was darker than the surrounding field, the soil dry and gray, filled with an eerie, quiet energy that seemed to pulse with each step I took. And then I saw him, a figure standing at the edge of the dead patch, just visible in the fading light. He was tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face hidden in shadow. I froze, watching him, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. But he didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, his gaze fixed on something beyond me, his posture rigid, almost unnatural. I wanted to call out, to ask who he was, but fear held me in place. And before I knew it, he was gone, disappearing into the shadows, leaving only silence, thick and oppressive, pressing down on me. When I returned to the house, I told my grandparents about the man, hoping they'd have an explanation. Their faces grew pale, and my grandmother shook her head, her voice barely more than a whisper. They say he was a farmer who lived here long ago. He lost his family in a terrible accident, and they say he was so heartbroken he wandered the fields until he disappeared. Some believe his spirit is still there, bound to the land, searching for the family he lost. Since that night, I haven't ventured near the dead patch, but sometimes when I'm out in the field at dusk, I see him, a faint figure standing at the edge of the patch, his gaze filled with a sorrow so deep it makes my chest ache. And each time I hear his voice, faint but constant, calling out, a reminder of the spirit that lingers, forever searching for what he can never find.